This is the On Humans podcast, a show which makes new research in humanities and human sciences more accessible to anyone with or without a degree and more meaningful to the big questions around our self-understanding. I'm your host, Ilari Mäkelä, and I'm very glad to bring to you another episode on the science of war and peace. The most recent episode covered that topic, but from a very different point of view. We talked there about hunter-gatherers, cave paintings, chimpanzees. In this episode, we turn into more recent history, and perhaps one way to think about it is that we're not asking about whether humans as humans are predisposed for war, but rather whether states as states are thus predisposed. Now, there's a whole field dedicated to this question of international relations, and my guest today, David Kang, is a Korean-American international relations scholar who points out very aptly that a lot of the theories, a lot of the conclusions in this field are based on European history alone. Looking at the question from East Asia, from China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, looking at it from these points of views, he said that we would reach very different conclusions. And in this case, Kang hopes, and I hope, that some of the remarkably peaceful aspects of East Asian history might serve us as lessons onto how to build peace in the 21st century. And we do discuss those certain remarkable elements. But of course, it's not like a war hasn't happened in East Asia. We talk about the constant warfare on China's Western Front against the Mongols and other nomadic people, about China's imperialist expansion. We talk about the wars of Japan against China, and about whether the so-called Thucydides trap, one of these famous Europe-based international relations ideas, means that war between China and the US is inevitable. This is a really exciting episode because we're getting two topics at once. On the one hand, this continues the long theme of war and peace. But on the other hand, this also continues the theme launched with the miniseries on Chinese history earlier this fall. Indeed, we literally talk about the all-important civil service exams that were so much at the center of the conversation on China's history, and now seeing how that plays out, not just in China, but in the understanding of the whole East Asian region from Japan, Korea to Vietnam. So this is in a way one step on the long path of trying to understand the broad contours of the stories of more and more areas around the world. Again, co-hosting with me is Jordan Schneider, host of China Talk. It's a pleasure to have him on again. He just brings such excellent points about history that might have slipped past me. And I think we kind of play a good cop bad cop here, where I help articulate Kang's theory and then he helps push back against it. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this episode. If you do, as always, I just want to say, please do show some support. Just subscribing to the show and to the On Humans newsletter really, really helps. You can get the On Humans newsletter at onhumans.substack.com. I'm currently searching for a publisher for my upcoming book on the human journey. It's a very exciting thing, and the growing following that I have is really the only good argument I have to the publishers to give me a nice deal. So you can be part of that journey by subscribing, by sharing with friends, by giving a 5-star review. And of course, if you want to make sure that I have some money in my pocket before I get that nice, sweet book deal, then head to patreon.com/onhumans, where I can join the wonderful group of people already supporting me. So thank you so much for everyone who's doing it. Thank you so much if you're considering it and haven't done so yet. And hey, whatever you're doing, whether you're running on the treadmill, running errands, or just wanting to learn more about humans, welcome to the show. I really hope that you enjoy it. And please welcome David Kang, author of many fascinating books, including most recently with Shinruma, a book called Beyond Power Transitions that we've based so much of this discussion on. Enjoy. Professor Kang, your book has a lot of fascinating East Asian history. I love East Asian history. I really enjoyed it, but I think that there's a bigger message for everyone interested in the logic of war and peace. What do you think people who are not familiar with the East Asian history get wrong when they think about international relations and war?
You know, the biggest thing that came to us from starting to research this book was how many times great power stumbled for internal reasons and not because of great power war or challenges from the outside. So that's what I'd say is probably the biggest lesson that I would have people take away.
Yeah, it's striking. You say that the East Asia, consisting of the countries we're familiar with, a proper state of China, a proper state of Japan, of Korea, of Vietnam, this forms towards the end of the first millennium. And from the time on that you start having these clear states, it's only a handful of times that there is a kind of land grab, a war in the kind of thing that's so familiar from European history. And that they, at least if you look at their dynamics with each other, it's remarkably peaceful.
Well, I mean, this is the thing that I've sort of spent my career trying to make that argument. And it doesn't mean that Asian countries don't ever fight. They fight a lot sometimes. But the way that wars worked and the types of land grabs and the type of power transition that we think are universal as part of the inevitable human condition actually seem to be pretty European in nature, right?
There's a big difference, right, in what happens to the east of China and what happens to the west of China. And I mean, the Mongols are just one of the examples of trouble on the Western frontier.
Yes.
The very reason why there is the Great War, for example. And I mean, what's really striking, I think, in the way that you tell the East Asian story, is that yes, China on its Western front has this kind of constant, if not war, there's at least constant kind of threat of violence, and that's something that is lacking on the Eastern front, and also on the Vietnamese front, at least from the conception of the Vietnamese state around the year 1000. And that, I think, has an interesting counterexample to that. There's one time when Japan goes crazy. I think we should cover that. But maybe before you cover that, do you want to just say something a little bit more about this way in which those four countries, Vietnam, Korea, Japan, China, form something that's really remarkably kind of different than what we not only do we see in Europe, but what we also see on the, for example, Western frontier of China?
I mean, one of the things that I find so interesting is how the ways that we think about the world get sort of codified, they become conventional wisdoms, and then we stop even questioning it. So first of all, the lessons of history are always, Athens or things, the Crusades. It's always European. I get it, right? But it's always European. And secondly, even when conventional or mainstream historians talk about China, again and again and again, they talk about the threats to China came from the Western steppe, from the semi-nomadic peoples that lived, along the Great Plains, whether it was Mongols or the Xiongnu thousands of years ago. And we just take that for granted. That's, as you said, that's why they built the Great Wall, all these threats to China.
I mean, even people who know Chinese history just from Disney films will know that there are some really wicked people there in the West who want to attack, and Mulan has to go and fight.
Mulan, right? The one thing we know about Chinese history is Mulan, protecting China from the barbarians, right? But if we look to the East and to the South, where these were recognizably kingdoms, these are recognizably sort of nascent, I call them nascent states, right? They were governments. They had territory. They were bureaucratically administered. These weren't semi-nomadic tribes, moving around from various agrarian regions to, up the mountains and down. These were settled agrarian states, bureaucratically administered, with long-standing bureaucracies. They had written language. They used Chinese script, etc. These were clearly governments. They, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, should have been terrified of China. And yet nobody's building walls to defend themselves against any of this. So on the eastern side and the southern side, these countries managed to craft remarkably stable relationships with each other. Now, in a way, this shouldn't be surprising. If we can move away from what we think should happen from Europe, and we just start with, well, there's a bunch of countries, some are bigger, some are smaller, but all of these countries that are trying to do the same things could literally understand each other. Literally, and when I say that, I mean, they use Sinic script. Every alphabet in Japanese is borrowed or modified from Chinese characters. The Koreans use it, the Vietnamese use it. 60 to 70% of the vocabulary in these countries is Chinese borrowed words. They could talk and they crafted relations. And these smaller countries in many ways tried to emulate the Chinese experience of, they often even borrowed the same governmental form, 6 ministries, et cetera, a written examination to hire civil servants. So in a way, if we start from that, it's not surprising that these countries could craft stable relations with each other. And that's very different from Chinese or even Korean relations with the semi-nomadic peoples, whether they be Mongols or Xiongnu or whatever else on their west, who didn't want those same things. The Mongols didn't want necessarily to have written bureaucratic systems, et cetera, until the part of them conquered China, and then they did for about 100 years. But it fell apart because that culture was very, very different, and it never really became settled. So in many ways, what we came back to was this, when we talk about international relations, that it's not simply power differentials. It's not simply who's stronger and bullies everyone else. It's, do we understand each other? Do we have a common culture or vocabulary? Or are we part of a great conversation where we're like, okay, we should do this, we shouldn't do that?
And I think one really interesting thing to notice in the history is that it's not that this case was always just rolling along with them having bureaucracies, etc. Actually, with Jordan, we interviewed Yashang Huang earlier for a whole thing where we talked a lot about the way that the civil service exam shapes China.
Yeah.
And it's really, I think it's a nice link to your work where you show it's not only China, but it's then also Japan, it's Korea, it's Vietnam emulating that civil service exam. And also, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's the Sui dynasty, which is the dynasty that really institutionalized
The sort of originator.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, they attacked Korea there was like skirmishes between them and Korea, but it's really that kind of civil service era, especially when it reaches all the places that you start seeing this peace. And I think why that's so important is the case of Vietnam, because a lot of Vietnamese would say, hold on a second, China was the constant bully. And your pushback, if I'm right, is that, well, there was a time when there was a lot of things happening, but if you look at the Vietnam with the civil service exams and the proper state from the year 1000 roughly onwards,
Yeah.
you don't have that anymore. And so there really is a kind of time before and a time after. And it is once these cultures start to really kind of work in the same, roughly similar way that you get this remarkable stability.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the ways in which Vietnam, for example, has maintained its independence was by instantly engaging in tribute relations with China. At the time, Song, right, when they became independent around 1079, and they entered into tributary relationships. And I'm currently doing some research right now where I'm trying to go back through the Ming Shilu and the Qing Shilu, which are the veritable records of the Ming and the Qing dynasties in China, which are about 1400 to 1900. And I'm really interested to see how the elites in Beijing, in the Ming government, talked about Vietnam. Because the Vietnamese would tell you they're always bullying us, they're always trying to invade. This is very much a 20th century perspective back on time, which didn't exist at the time, right? If you look back at what actually the Vietnamese were saying to the Chinese, often they were saying things like, there would be a debate in Vietnam as to which, there's some rebellion and there's a faction, and both sides would appeal to the Ming court or the Qing court and say, we're the legitimate rulers, recognize us. And the Chinese, that you can see these debates in China among the elites where they say, we got to figure out who we recognize here. But there is almost no discussion in the Qing historical records. There's no mention of, should we invade this time? Is this our chance to take over Vietnam? It's all, who's the legitimate ruler? How do we stabilize our relations? And on the Vietnamese side, often it was, if we have recognition from China, then we're the legitimate ruler. We're the ones. And it was this very much an aspirational type of relationship. That border between Vietnam and China was formally negotiated. And I think that I should look, I think it's 1079 that it was formally negotiated. And that border is literally in the same place today.
That's one.
That's almost 1,000 years where that border has not changed. Right? They put down 2 bronze pillars. There's a great book by Liam Kelly called Beyond the Bronze Pillars, right? They put down these gates, and here's where Vietnam starts, and here's where China starts. And that's what it's been ever since. That's remarkable stability.
Let's push back a little bit. So I think like the key difference that Ilary and I came to with sort of comparing the East Asian experience with the European experience is at the end of the day, there's China and there's some gnats. And some of the gnats figure out how to not get squished, and some of the gnats don't. And so, we don't have any kingdoms in Yunnan anymore. Like Tibet had a rough time of it. Xinjiang had a rough time of it. I mean, just all these like ethnic minorities who like used to do their own thing get sort of agglomerated. And, you also go north with like, taking over, big chunks of northeastern China. But like, it just so happened that there was enough sort of historical happenstance that, Vietnam, Korea, and Japan woke up early enough, were sort of far enough away, were not important enough to, create this sort of like understanding where there wasn't enough of a payoff from a Chinese leader perspective if they're already basically like getting all that they want, and they get to feel good that these foreigners are bringing them, cows and like inscriptions or whatever. They're just like, all right, like we have no choice because, from your like national power calculation perspective, China is just like 100x bigger than we are. This is not the sort of thing where you've got, a Holy Roman Empire and you got a French king and you got some like city states in Italy trying to, work work out like who's top dog or whatever. So
You're absolutely right. So one of the other things that I probably should have said, one of the ways that I do this if I sort of give a talk is I say, look, Europe was a balance of power system. It was a multipolar system. It was, and it still is today. Asia has and is a hegemonic system. It's got one massive power and a bunch of smaller countries. They're not going to behave the same way. The way that we think that multipolar balance of power systems behave doesn't track or analogize to East Asia. It's a very different system, and it's developed that way over 1,500 years or so. Actually, from the first time China was unified, let's call it 2,000 years, is everybody had to figure out not how do we expand and become stronger, blah, blah, blah. It's how do we survive and exist and grow and pursue what we want in the shadow of an enormously central power that is not, it's not going away. You're not moving away. They're not moving away, right? You are stuck. You have to work out this unequal relationship. And to just hint about the future a little bit, that is what's going on today. The one thing I want to say, every aspirational quote I hear, or every time I read from somebody in the DC blob about Asia's going to balance China, I say, no, they're not. No, they're not. That is never going to happen. The countries in Asia are not going to join a U.S. containment coalition against China. That's not how it's going to work. They have to live with China. They don't have to like it, but they have to craft a relationship with this massive country. And that's what they did back then.
For all those civilizations out there who didn't like synthesize fast enough, like Xinjiang, Tibet, Yunnan, and whatnot, basically, like, did they just decide not to run the, South Korea, Vietnam playbook? Like what, or was, were the, farmland was too good? Like what's the explanatory variable here?
Well, there's two possible explanations, and I lean towards the cultural one as opposed to the material one, right? The material one would be, well, the farmland was better and the horses were, it was better to have horses this way, et cetera, et cetera. So they just fought and, they couldn't agree on what they wanted to do and things like that. I suspect, and I have a great quote in one of the books from somebody who does much more on the Western steppes than I do. But he said, it wasn't that. The nomads and the Chinese had very clear conceptions of who they were and what they wanted. And the nomads didn't want to change their way of life. Right. And this is, sometimes you even see it now with sort of Mongolian, every now and then on like Twitter or whatever else, someone will show the Mongolians, living in the yurts and riding the horses and being semi-nomadic, moving up the hills during the summer and things like that. I'm moving down and then moving back up. And so part of the answer is they didn't want what the Chinese wanted. These are incompatible worldviews, and they knew it.
Let me try to push back on that. So there is a third or a in-between explanation, which is that there's actually two Western frontiers. One is the Himalayas, and you do see some stability in the Tibetan kind of, whatever we're going to call it, statehood, etc. And then the other one is this famous steppe. And if you live on the steppe, you basically decided to live on grass. Humans don't eat grass. You need to have animals that eat grass and turn it into an energy that humans can use. But grass is very not energy dense thing, which means that you have to move around a large area. So immediately, if you've decided this lifestyle, which is that you're going to live from grass energy, you are just going to fundamentally want to have a nomadic lifestyle. And once you have a nomadic lifestyle, it's almost like the energy demands will dictate the culture to be one where horse riding around a large plain is cool. And you can't have people cramming Confucian classics for a civil service exam, which then runs large granaries where you have rice stored for a famine, because that's just not how life on the steppe works. So I think that if you just look at the steppe experience, I think it's quite understandable why they don't suddenly become a Korea. And I think that it is quite materialistic in a sense, even if, of course, culture funnels that material demand. So that's my suggestion on on the energy history of the steppe. But either one of you take it down.
I would say one thing, which again, there are material explanations for it. I think there's also a way in which they liked the way they lived. And you could imagine a bargain if they were going to be, willing to play the game halfway, where they could figure out something where they trade for this, they do that, et cetera, et cetera. And they did that a little bit, but they didn't fundamentally want to change their way of life. And I think that's what it came down to. I've been more focused on the Eastern side, which is relatively understudied. And so I will admit, I am not a steppe scholar. I've not been spending a lot of time thinking about China-steppe relations as much as I've been trying to explain, because everybody focused on that. That's where all the fighting was. I'm trying to explain the stability on the Eastern side, which is not an excuse for not knowing it. To me, in many ways, the stability on the Eastern side is in many ways more interesting, because we don't ever expect that to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of like the thing I'm thinking about in particular is less Tibet and less like the steppe, and more like that like swath of like Yunnan and Sichuan that got taken over from like 1,000 to 1,500.
Fair enough. Yeah.
That, kind of has like a normal landscape. It's not like a particularly dramatic place that Imperial China, for whatever reason, was able to just like wash over. Like you had like dozens of these like little kingdoms and cultures, and the vast majority, I mean, basically every single one of them, like if you're looking west, is no longer able to do their own thing.
Yeah. This to me is, I often do this, right? When I'm teaching class, I say there's two countries. Well, imagine a country that starts out with a populated, urbanized, sophisticated eastern seaboard that slowly moves out to a largely unorganized, uninstitutionalized frontier to its west, expanding outward, tending to slaughter all of the indigenous peoples who were there while they pushed until they couldn't expand any longer. Right? You have two countries that did that, China and the United States, right? That to me is very simple, because those are frontiers. And what happened is China expanded as we turned frontiers into borders up until they met Russia, or up until they met, the Himalayas or whatever else. And that's a very similar project that what goes on around the world. My one sentence history of the world is it's turning frontiers into borders, right? Over, 20,000 years and 10,000 years, that's what we've done. And so those countries those peoples, they had been sort of sparring with Tibet for 1,000 years. I mean, the first Chinese that took, or first whatever, was like Tang was, fighting and sparring with the Tibetans. Then they get free, then they get taken over. They had these constant troubles, which is why the Chinese expanded westward, right? It was, they tried defense with the Great Wall. They tried bribery with trying to give goods and stuff like that. They tried eventually they incorporated these as they moved farther and farther out. And the nomads retreated farther and farther back until there's nowhere to go. That is absolutely in some ways I'm not sure I want to put a moral judgment on it. I mean, we did this in the United States as well. That's sort of what happened.
So I think, would it be right then to say that the European model, you assume kind of billiard ball table, you have these equally sized balls, very hard as themselves, but then they, bump into each other. And then when you look at East Asia, what you see instead is that there's no violence. There is the internal rebellions. There is the Western frontier with the steppe nomads. But that the logic of Europe is not the logic that you would see, especially not between these four countries. I think Korea is kind of poster boy for that kind of relationship with China. Vietnam, many Vietnamese would push back and say, no, the Chinese were always trying to come. And then they talk about the Trang sisters, and you say, yeah, but the Trang sisters were before this whole, sinification of the Vietnamese culture. What about Japan? Japan not only, of course, has the famous wars in the late 1800s, early 20th century, but even the really things go wild in East Asia in the late 1500s, the Imjin War, which I think most listeners won't even have heard about. I didn't register that this war ever happened before I read your book, and it sounds like things really went wild. But let's why don't you tell the quick story of the Imjin War, and also think, how much do you think that Japan is actually a little bit more Europe-like than the rest of these examples?
So, who's heard of the Spanish Armada, right? Everybody's heard of that, I'm going to contrast that, because 1588, the Spanish Armada the Spaniards tried to invade London, and they sent, I think it was like 130 ships and 20,000 troops. The biggest force in Renaissance Europe ever seen. 4 years later, on the other side of the globe, in 1592, the Japanese tried to conquer China, and they started by invading Korea to get to China. So exact contemporaneous with the Spanish Armada. 300,000 Japanese troops, 700 ships. The scale of the war was 5 to 10 times what you could even think. You couldn't even think of that in Europe at that time. That's the ability of these countries to fight war when they wanted to. The scale they could fight, the logistical, organizational capacity of these East Asian countries dwarfed anything you could think.
Why, by the way? Why? Is that because of their civil service, their bureaucracy being more centralized, more complicated?
Yes, and this will get back to briefly what Japan is or is not. In 700 AD, the Japanese ministry had like 7,000 people working in its bureaucracy. 500 years later, the Catholic Curia, which is the model of modern European, 500 years later, the Curia had around 500 people working in it. And it was the most organized thing in all of Europe, right? The Japanese, who are widely considered less organized, less sophisticated, less educated, etc., than Koreans and Chinese and Vietnamese. Japan was considered the barbarian one, the less developed one. Its organization and its bureaucrats and its civil service exam, which they used for like 400 years, dwarfed what you could imagine in Europe. All these countries had the capacity to do that. They just didn't choose to do it that way. China did because China always had a big army because they had, again, the Western steppe and all those kind of things, right? So when they decided to fight, the capacity of these countries to create a massive army and ships and organization and logistics and supply was unthinkable in Europe at the time. So that's the context why we should study this war. It's one of the great wars, and it doesn't work the way we think it should work. Because number one, China was always bigger. As we pointed out, China was bigger than Japan. If anybody should be invading, China should be invading Japan. But this Japanese general, Hideyoshi, had unified. There had been a breakdown for about 100 years. There was a breakdown of central rule in Japan. So Hideyoshi unified Japan. And then I have not yet heard a definitive argument for why he decided to invade China. Ego and hubris is certainly one. There is a large argument that it was domestic politics, and it's because he had united a bunch of warring different factions, daimyo and stuff like that, in order to both get their soldiers out of Japan so they couldn't revolt against him, and to keep them happy and get them more gold and stuff like that, send them out. What's pretty clear, though, is that he didn't actually do a whole lot of scouting and measuring of the relative balance of power between him and China, or even him and Korea. There's almost no record that they were sitting there saying, they're weaker, we're stronger. Any of these calculations of balance of power that we say occurs when wars start. There's almost no evidence that he did any of that. The other interesting thing about this is, anyone coming up, if you just get one big country and two small countries, like Korea and Japan and China, one big country, China, two small countries, all IR theory would say the two small countries should ally together and form an alliance against the big country.
And it's very modern, by the way, with those two countries. There's a lot of people who think, why are they not more friendly with each other?
And they're still saying that, right? That's what I mean. There's so much that tracks to today as well. Like, why don't they, anyone would say the small countries should ally together and huddle together against the big country, but that's not what happened. Instead, Japan invaded Korea, who was not expecting it, because it was like, you must be kidding. The Koreans had word that there was a buildup for a couple of years, and they were like, refused to believe it. Went to the Chinese and said, we need help, China. Even the Chinese didn't believe it at first. Thought, you're kidding me. So it took a while for the Chinese to actually take it seriously. And then the Chinese sent troops, and essentially, along with Admiral Yi Sun-shin, cutting their supply lines because he was a great admiral, the Japanese advance got pushed all the way back to Pusan. They spent a couple years negotiating. Hideyoshi died, and then they invaded again a second time, and then got crushed and went back to Japan in 1598. Now, the other amazing thing about this is, Obviously, the Korean government would not have survived if the Chinese weren't there. The Chinese troops were completely in charge of the Korean Peninsula after this war in 1598. All they had to do was say, okay, we're in charge. You guys are, this is now the 33rd province or whatever. That's all the Chinese had to do is stay. But within about a year, they all went home. They're like, this isn't our country. This is Korea. Okay, good luck with that. And then they took off. The Koreans were actually trying to get them to stay because they thought the Japanese might come a third time. So none of this tracks to the way we think it should happen. The Chinese could have just stayed. They're like, this isn't our country. That goes to not power. That goes to a conception of who we are and who we aren't. And do we care about this and do we not? It's not a simple, endless expansion, like gas that expands to fill the, the space available. Countries don't. Empirically, they don't simply expand as much as they can. And so much of this war doesn't act at all the way we think that war should act. So it's a very interesting war, and it doesn't track at all with the way we expect wars should track. But it does track with China's a big country. Korea had good relations with it. They are, Japan had this one guy who, for very interesting domestic reasons, decided he was going to try and invade everyone else. But the system sort of snaps back to stability in ways that we simply do not see in the European experience. It's the only war. It's the only war between Japan, Korea, and China in 600 years, from 1200 to 1800. So the only war in 600 years between these countries. And they clearly had the capacity to fight, which is the thing. It's not that they weren't able to. It's not that there were a bunch of tribes running around. These were countries with massive capacities that simply chose not to fight.
And I think that it is easy to see the Indian War as the kind of weird exception that almost proves the rule of the stability because, like you said, the reaction was like, no, you gotta be kidding. Like, that's obviously not gonna happen. Oh, okay, it is happening. But the same, it does not hold for the much more familiar Japan attacks China in the late 1800s, and then, of course, with the World Wars. And I think that that's one of the kind of key things that we wanted to push back when talking with Jordan earlier, is that one of the kind of major IR theories that you feel, based in the book, is too Eurocentric, is the so-called Thucydides trap, which is, they have the rising power and the declining power. And whenever that happens, what was the famous number was in 12 out of 16 cases where you have this.
There's a war, yeah.
There's a war, yeah. And then you say that, well, you just don't see that in the East Asian history, which is, okay, fair enough. But there's a much more Thucydides-like way of reading that, which is that, yes, because you just don't have any power able to challenge China. I think this is also what Jordan was getting at earlier. And lo and behold, the moment when Japan, due to industrialization, is able to challenge the hegemon, they immediately do. So in what sense do you think that East Asia is a counterexample to the Thucydides trap, which excites a lot of attention nowadays because of the China-US dynamic? Versus actually, it's one of those cases where, well, you have like a sample size of 1 in the whole East Asian history of this being the case. And lo and behold, Japan, it behaves exactly like the Western IR theorists, international relations theorists would predict Japan to behave.
That's great, right? I mean, and this is where I think it's so interesting, because you have a traditional, or whatever you want to call it, East Asian world order. And that world order had its own set of principles and values and expectations. And it was, as we've been talking, remarkably stable. The arrival of the Western imperial powers in the 19th century blew that all apart. And I think in some ways, this is I haven't done research on this. I'm going back farther in time as opposed to up closer. But to me, this era is, if there are IR scholars out there who want to talk about how do we understand a change of world orders, this is the time people should be studying. Because there's examples of, like, the Japanese learned first Western theory, and they learned French, to speak French. And they come and they're arguing with the Chinese in 1879 over Taiwan and the status of this and the other thing. And the Chinese wanted to use the tribute system way of interacting, speaking in Chinese and the same principles and the norms. And the Japanese were like, what are you talking about? We write in French. We write down a contract, and they're like, what's a contract? I mean, literally different worldviews. How do you sort that out? What does it mean, right? So there's as much questions of what is modernity, or what does this mean to have an international system, as well as just simply who's stronger or not. They didn't understand each other anymore. They were using different languages to argue about stuff. And some of the most fascinating research is why Japan, responded better than China. And in many ways, it makes sense that, my quick and dirty explanation is, China was the hegemon. They were like, why should we change? Whereas the Japanese were happy to change. And so rapidly learned, borrowed German military training and English business practices and everything else, right? So you do get a very different set of worldviews. And when we get back to the actual war, right? The way I would call it is, I'm not so sure I would call it a power transition war per se, because this was as much about Japan defending its own survival as it was about expanding into China. And the Japanese were lucky in some ways because they weren't as valuable a source as China. So they had more time to adjust. And then the question for the Japanese is, how do we become a great power? And I think it's more that question that was motivating the Japanese than a Thucydides power transition trap. It was like, how do we become recognized and survive as a country? Well, what do great powers do? They have a flag. I mean, we'll get to the other stuff, but this is not super. They have a flag. I have this great photo of like the Japanese emperor, like 2 years apart, like 1870. In one, he's dressed in the traditional garb. And then he's dressed like Bismarck. He's got a sword and a mustache and a bunch of medals. I mean, they're like, this isn't how we do it. If we're going to survive, in a similar way to how do we make ourselves recognizable? But on top of that, we get a military, we become a colonial power, we take possessions, and then we say we're just like you. So half of what Japan was doing was actually aimed from the racial equality clause at the League of Nations in 1919 to simply being an imperial power, was aimed at the European countries, as well as then half of it focused on China and readjusting that relationship. So, I mean, it sort of fits. Again, if you don't look too closely, it fits. But if I look at the Japanese motivations, I see as much survival compared to the Western powers as I do a simple transition of power with respect to China itself.
Okay, fair enough. But I think that because, that your whole book is titled Beyond Power Transitions, I think we can't let you off the hook so easily.
Go ahead, yes. Keep my feet to the fire.
It might be the case that that you have an alternative explanation to the kind of power transition explanation. But it's another thing that, you can explain away this one case. It's another thing to say that East Asia does not support a kind of power transition theory, because again, there the pushback would be like, either it kind of positively supports or it's kind of neutral, because you just don't have a normal moment with any power transition happening in East Asia. Which then the kind of traditional IR scholars would say, well, if we do have a genuine power transition happening somewhere, for example, with the US, China, well, we have to go to look at the only cases where this has happened, and whether we exclude the Japan case or not, it still looks like, well, we are back in the classical 12 out of 16 cases. Because the whole East Asian history, although it's fascinating and it shows this remarkable capacity of countries to live peacefully with each other, well, it doesn't show that you can have a power transition without war.
Well, okay, so two other things. So in some ways, I would say, fair enough, right? We are getting to the question that we get to today. We're getting to that question, which is the entire world now Westphalian? Right? Has the European Westphalian model of international relations, nation states, balance of power, as I said, flag, are we all that way now? And so none of the other stuff has any impact. And in some ways, if that's the case, that yes, we are all Westphalian, then we do then have a debate about, does this apply, does this not apply, et cetera, et cetera. The question, though, is how deeply did we actually make this transition to a Western country, so to speak, right? And my argument there is that I think it's extremely thin. I think it's very superficial. One of my big critiques of power transition theory is that it should be universal. That's what they claim. This is a universal. Our argument, we are trying to regionalize power transitions to Europe, so to speak, right? That it wasn't simply inevitable, that it was based on some ideas and beliefs about how we behave, et cetera, that happened in Europe and not anywhere else. If we go to Asia, we don't see those same beliefs. We also don't see that same behavior.
Okay, well, I think it's time. Let's make this all about our times. You meet someone who's like, oh, this is all cool. I learned a lot of history. I like history, but what the heck does this have to do with like whether there's a American ship bumping into a Chinese ship on the Taiwan Strait and all hell breaks loose?
To me, the most important lesson from looking at all this history is that we should ask and not simply assume whether this power transition dynamic is the most important dynamic to be looking at. In other words, it is just taken for granted now in Washington, D.C., and probably around the world, whatever else, that rising and declining power, and U.S. is declining and it's going to get weak, and China's rising, so they have rising ambitions. That's the key dynamic that's going on today in Asia. And if anything, our book should cause us to pause and ask, is that really the most important dynamic? And our answer would be, no, it's not. It's not at all. And what do we mean by that? The most important dynamic, we still go back to the other lesson which we've avoided. We haven't really talked about it that much, right? Which was that if you look at the Korean dynasties, right next to China, every single one of them fell for internal reasons. The Shilla dynasty, the Koryo dynasty, and then Joseon was in the 20th century, which is different. Every one of the Japanese, Kamakura, whatever, they all fell internally. Same thing in Vietnam. Even the Chinese, they all fell. Song was conquered, but Tang internal, Ming internal, Qing internal, frankly, right? These internal dynamics are in many ways way more consequential than external. I read somewhere, and I'm probably stealing this quote, so I forget who said it, but empires die from suicide, not murder, is a way to think about it, right?
So, the modern PRC has some imperial legacies, but we were talking earlier about just how much imperial Japan changed, where one day you're wearing, I don't know what you call it. One day you're wearing clothes, the next day you're cosplaying as Bismarck. And, we've got a Marxist-Leninist system that has Marx, Lenin, Engels as their, three poster boys, not like Hanfeize or whatever. So how do you interpret this question of to what extent is the modern PRC queuing off of versus going off this? Because of course, like Mao, right? Like he wanted global revolution. Funding revolutions in South America and Angola and what have you, threatening nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So, we have at least one really dramatic case study in our sample size of 4 CCP leaders who are, at the level of, are very much out there on the spectrum of let's just live in sort of peaceful harmony under this, old system that we had a great time under since 500.
Right. This is the question, and I don't think we answer this question enough. Is China today still the China of 2 centuries ago? Of course, we're all modern now. I do this as not as a joke, but as sort of a fun thing. When I'm teaching Intro to IR, and I got a bunch of international kids as well as Americans, I'll say, how many of us have a passport? Everybody raises their hand. How many of you from China have a passport? Right? They all keep their hand up. They have to, obviously, if they're here in America, right? To the Americans that don't have a passport, I yell at them and I say, shut up. Anyway, and I'll say, look, nobody in China is questioning that this is what matters, that you are a nation state, that this little book tells you who you belong to, that this is how we're going to, that's all modernity. That's all the modern world, whether we call it Westphalia or whatever else. Nobody questions that, right? If you listen to the Chinese, and I'm making a joke now, so please nobody get mad at me. It's a joke, so you can see. But if you listen to the Chinese national anthem, again, it sounds like it was written in 1870s Vienna. It's like, oompa, oompa. It's not Tring, tring. It's not Beijing opera, right? What you'd think if it's Chinese, it would have this Beijing opera music or something else. But no, it's not. It's a Western thing. So in many ways, China, like everybody else, is living in a modern world. But I think almost every single main Chinese foreign policy interest or agenda or purpose is what I'm calling transdynastic. None of it is new. And that is what I think is really important. Because what I don't, yes, Mao had this sort of thing about global stuff and he devoted some money to it. But in general, if we go through the Chinese interests, what we see is they're not even just Xi Jinping's interests. They're not even CCP interests from the 1940s. Most of them were inherited from the KMT in the 30s and go back to the Qing dynasty, if not more. And the clearest example of that I give is Taiwan. This is not a new interest. It's not a KMT interest. The Qing explicitly were saying, don't take this, Japan, or else our relations will be poisoned forever. This is not new. This is old. Hong Kong. That's 1841 or, whenever 1839, let's say, right? These are not new interests in sort of unifying what is China. Let me put it differently. We have important scholarly books written in English by top sinologists or whatever, if you have China relations, who claim that Taiwan is just the starting point, and then after that, it'll be a nice jump to the Philippines, or it'll be a nice jump to, why not Vietnam? You know that Vietnam and China now conduct joint naval patrols in Haiphong Bay and stuff like that. They do this. They disagree about some things, but they cooperate on everything else. So I have a very different perspective on how much China's interests have expanded as its power has grown. I don't see that. I see its ability to try and get its historic or its very long enduring interests, its ability to try and affect those to be better.
You have a great line in the book, which is, despite decades of Western predictions to the contrary, it is by now widely admitted that East Asian states are not forming a balancing coalition against China out of fear of its rise. There's two ways to read that. One is the kind of, well, they don't see a need. And actually, I think you point this out, that the military spending as a percentage of GDP has just been declining and declining and declining in all East Asian and Southeast Asian states, whether they are US allies or not. But then there's another way of reading this, which is that, well, US is the kind of gray eminence, the elephant in the room or whatever. And a lot of people in the US would want to believe that it is only because of their benevolence and their fleet that such reductions in military spending can happen, and that people don't feel like they have to really worry about China.
I've heard that argument for decades, right? And I'm not quite convinced it's true. And I'll tell you why for a couple of reasons, right? We mentioned it briefly at the beginning. Korea and Japan should be natural allies. I mean, the amount of bleating I've heard over the decades about, come on, Koreans, stop being dumb. Don't you realize Japan's your friend and China's your enemy? It doesn't work. It does not play. Okay? Those are not arguments that are going to work. Koreans don't love China. They don't hate Japan as much as we think they do. But most of the region is not functioning the way we think it should in a good realist sense. So a lot of American policymakers or policy functionaries are hectoring Asian countries. Don't you realize you're supposed to balance China? And they're like, what are you talking about? So I want to start with that notion that it's not acting the same way. So we go to these type of arguments. And you already hinted at one of the first things I want to say. Sure, the U.S. is keeping the peace or blah, blah, blah. But if you're Vietnam or Malaysia, U.S. isn't defending you. And you're closer to China than, say, the Philippines is, which is a U.S. ally. So you should see difference. If the U.S. is the cause of why countries aren't afraid, you should see a difference in the countries that do not have a U.S. guarantee. And you don't see that.
Okay. So Professor David Kang, thank you so much for your time today. And final question I always ask my guests is, how has your research shaped your outlook on humanity?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be part of this. Probably the biggest way that my research has changed the way I think about the world and my view on humanity is that the more that I've done scholarship, whether it's the original stuff I was doing on economic growth and political economy and corruption in East Asia, and now obviously for decades on history, it's that our values and our beliefs are far more central to our behavior than is simply some kind of cost-benefit analysis. I see this again and again and again. And I think we as scholars, as social scientists, we're much more comfortable with cost-benefit. Well, they're doing it for this reason. But I think people are motivated by what their values are and what they believe in so much more than just are they going to benefit or not. And I see that across like individual behavior and the way the countries behave.
Okay, that was it for today. Thank you so much for sticking with us until the very end. I hope that you enjoyed this. If you do, and if you want to hear more about topics of war and peace, you can check out my past episode 48 with Luke Lowacki on the origins of war. And there are many episodes linking to that. You can also head to YouTube. I'm now posting shorter clips, 5 to 10 minutes each, taking some of the highlights from these episodes into video format. So yeah, you can see my face and you can have something to share with friends if they're not into long-form podcasts, but you think that they might enjoy some of these topics. There's links in the show notes. And again, if you want to support, subscribe there, subscribe here, subscribe at onhumans.substack.com. And yeah, I hope that you tune in on the 1st of December for the next episode. Until then, take care.